Okay, welcome. Today we are going to travel from Corinth, where we were a couple of weeks ago, travel west to Delphi. As far as we know, Paul himself never visited Delphi personally, but the reality that Delphi represents is everywhere in the background of the New Testament and indeed the Old Testament. So we can learn a lot about the background of the biblical world by visiting this site and seeing the significance it had in the ancient world. So we're going to pull up those slides for you and journey west from Corinth to the city, to not a city really, it's actually a kind of like a retreat area. Uh, so now if you go to Delphi today, you would probably come by land. Delphi's right about there on the slopes of Mount Parnassus. You would come by land from the north, or you'd come around this way by land and cross the bridge. That's not the way people would have traveled in the ancient world. The people from Asia Minor would have all gone through Corinth and then by boat to Delphi. People from up here in Greece would have gone by boat and then crossed through Corinth to Delphi. So in their minds, Corinth and Delphi were very closely related. Most folks who were coming with a question for the oracle would stop through Corinth on the way, and people would say, "Hey, what's the question you're going to ask?" And on the way back through, the people would say, "Well, what answer did you get from the oracle?" So those two were really quite closely connected. In fact, from the top of the Acro Corinth, you literally can see Delphi on the slopes of Mount Parnassus. So when we're looking for overlaps, I look particularly in Paul's correspondence with Corinth, because I think that is where the close connection is, or closest connection. And remember that the temple that we looked at a week or two ago in Corinth is a temple to Apollo, and Apollo is the resident deity of Delphi. So there are just a lot of connections. So here we go to the site of Delphi itself. Very, very beautiful site, very lovely. This on the slopes of Mount Parnassus. Mount Parnassus was the home of the 9 muses also. So, and then just a very, very beautiful valley flowing down toward the Gulf of Corinth. As you visit Delphi today, you will walk up the slopes as people would have done in the ancient days. You'll walk past the rock of the Sibyl. It's important to remember that in one way or another, Delphi functioned for a little over 1,000 years, from about 700 BC till about 380 AD. And Delphi was understood for all of those 1,000 years as the spiritual center of the Greek world. Delphi was where you went to contact the deity and get guidance and get information from the deity, particularly Apollo. So if you were thinking of moving somewhere to plant a new colony, you would ask for advice. You were thinking of going to war, you would ask for advice. If you were thinking of getting married, you would ask the advice of the Oracle at Delphi. If the Persians were invading Greece, you would send it to the Oracle of Delphi to get advice on how to deal with the Persians. It was just a constant seeking after guidance from the unseen world. And this was the very, very earliest form of that. The tradition says that the Sibyl would stand there and would make prophecies. It was later that things became more regularized, more organized around the temple, and with very, very specific system for seeking the information. Often, if you went there to get information from the oracle, you would stand in line for days or weeks or even months. Nice thing about it was it's a very, very beautiful place to do that, and still is today. Delphi was one of 5 main oracles in Greece itself, others in what we call Asia Minor. And in fact, if you start looking for references to divination or oracles in the Bible, you find at least a dozen different places where oracles are mentioned. They were very much a part of the world. One of the early ones, Deuteronomy 18, where Moses lists all the different forms of divination that were happening in the world around Israel, and tells Israel to stay away from those. Maybe the most famous one is 1 Samuel 28, where Saul seeks guidance from a woman who practices necromancy, which is the technical term for conversing with the dead. In Acts chapter 16, verse 16, we were in Philippi a couple of weeks ago. The slave girl in the marketplace had a pythonic spirit, which is a direct allusion to the python, who was the source of the oracle here at Delphi. So what Luke is telling us in Acts 16, verse 16, is she had a spirit of divination similar to the spirit that was at work here in Delphi. It does seem that this was saturating the ancient world. I think one of the most interesting ones is Isaiah 8, verse 19, where Isaiah says, "Do not consult the oracles who chirp and mutter." And it shows that the biblical author has a very clear understanding of the odd way of speaking that the oracles had, and the muttering is the confused and somewhat mixed way that the oracles spoke. In fact, during the classical era at Delphi, the woman, the Pythia, who was sitting on the sacred tripod, she would be muttering and murmuring. The only persons who could supposedly understand her were the priests, who listened and then transcribed that and gave you your answer in a written way. So the chirping and muttering is just so distinctively understanding of what's happening. Chirping seems to be characteristic in the ancient world, that if you were speaking in a voice not your own, in an elevated or unusual voice, so it's not your natural voice, it must be the voice of the God speaking through you. And that's what's behind the happenings there in Acts chapter 16, and I think also here at Delphi. The competition to be at the head of the line with your question was so severe that many cities actually sent large offerings, beautiful gold and pottery and ivory and silver and sometimes so many offerings that they would build their own little treasury. This is the treasury of the Athenians. So they built this as an offering to the oracle at Delphi, and then filled it full of treasures as gifts to the oracle at Delphi to seek favor, to get farther to the head of the line when they came with their questions. This is just a very, very deep-seated and very competitive thing in the ancient world. As you walk up the slopes, you get closer and closer to the Temple of Apollo itself. This is the remains of the temple with the polygonal wall, kind of a retaining wall, but it's also special significance. There's that treasury of the Athenians and the polygonal wall with the inscriptions, and one of my students reading the Greek. But you can see the names. These are the names of slaves. People who had been held in slavery who were set free, and their names were then inscribed here at Delphi. So the god Apollo is a witness to the fact that these people have been manumitted. They have been set free. This is part of the background of Paul's letter to Philemon. Sometimes you'll hear people say that Paul is encouraging Philemon to set Onesimus free, and this would be very dramatic and unusual. Not true. Many people were manumitted in the Roman world. What's actually more dramatic is when Paul says to Philemon, accept him as a brother. Accept Onesimus as a brother. That would be more radical and more disruptive in the culture of first century Rome than simply granting him his freedom. And this wall is a testimony to that. Complete sanctuary here. Probably the closest comparison we would have would be to a permanent retreat site where people might gather every summer for a retreat. Not really a city, but a retreat center, a place where people pull away for a while. Theater built in here for ancient plays and also modern plays here at the Theater of Delphi. Here's another beautiful view of the valley. This a bird watching paradise yet today, and it does seem like there were a number of different forms of divination here taking place here. There was, of course, the listening to the oracle in the basement of the temple, but there was also watching the birds in flight. We still use the word auspicious. This might be an auspicious beginning if things are looking good. That comes directly from the Greek and Roman world of watching birds as they fly and then reading from the flight of the birds the will of the gods. And we say this augurs well for the future, another word that comes right straight from Greco-Roman divination. So some of these things are more current than we sometimes realize. And still, there's a particular species of eagle that loves to fly up and down this valley today. We're told the bird watchers enjoy visiting here. And there is also at times here simply casting of lots. If you came with a very simple question, you didn't necessarily have time with the oracle, you hadn't paid enough, you would simply ask your question, the priest would cast lots, give you a yes or no, and send you on your way. As you may know, the Romans also, every Roman general that went out had his sorcerer with him, what we would call, who would sacrifice the goat, study the liver, and decide the will of the gods. We think of the Romans as being so engineering, so scientific, but they were just saturated with various forms of divination. I learned recently from someone who has a master's degree in divination that during COVID, visits to magic websites went up 74%. So our world is not so far from this world of superstition and seeking to contact the supernatural in some way to get some sort of word from above. It seems to be very deep in the human psyche. The theater and the temple dedicated to Apollo. And then also a little farther up the slope, you can the stadium. There were 4 Olympic-style games in the Greek world. Those, of course, at Olympia, at Nemea, at Isthmia near Corinth, and then here at Delphi. You can see the starting line here, and the stadium very nicely preserved on the hillside there. So, as I said, this desire for contact with the divine seems to be very deep in the human heart, the human psyche, which is why Moses in Deuteronomy 18, Isaiah chapter 8 says, do not seek that way of contacting the Lord, but listen to his clear written word. This is where you will get your guidance. And I think, for example, of Paul's letter to the church at Corinth, we speak the wisdom of God not as the worldly wisdom, but verse 10, God has revealed to us by his Spirit. We have the written word enlightened to us by the Spirit. This is our way of guidance. And then a little bit later in chapter 4, we don't speak, Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4, this is, we don't speak in underhanded or unclear ways, but we speak openly and clearly. Openly and clearly. This is a direct contrast to the muttering of the oracles and the deliberate ambiguity of the oracles. The Oracle of Delphi is famous for sayings like, cast the bones of your mother behind you. And then you're left, what does that mean? Or the wooden walls will save you. What does that mean? Or when King Croesus came, say, should I cross the river to face the Persians? And the oracle replied, if you cross the river, a great empire will be destroyed. And he thinks to himself, well, I'll cross the river and destroy the Persians. He crossed the river, got smashed to smithereens by the Persians, came back to Delphi to complain. Oracle said, we told you a great empire would be destroyed. It was yours. So this kind of, even in this supposedly word from above, it's usually very convoluted, very enigmatic, very unclear, and yet people stood in line for days, weeks, and months to get those kind of answers. And Paul says, no, no, no. We have a clear word from the Lord. Follow that word. And again, back to 2 Corinthians 4, the Lord who commanded the light to shine out of darkness has shined in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. Again, a clear contrast to Apollo. Remember, Apollo is the god of light in the Greek world. The temple of Apollo here in Delphi and across the water a little ways in Corinth. And Paul says, no, it's the Lord who has commanded the light to shine out of darkness. Just another view of one of the installations at Delphi. This is Lower Delphi, Upper Delphi up here where we were a few minutes ago. In the museum, a few of those offerings have been preserved and recovered from the dirt. The charioteer of Delphi, fortunately buried for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years and been preserved for us. And then the valley as it goes down to the Gulf of Corinth. So as I said, most of the folks in that day would have arrived by water and then walked the short distance up the slopes here to Delphi. So, okay, and as I said before, every great slideshow ends with a sunset. So there is the sun shining on the slopes of Mount Parnassus. And so thank you for joining us, and may you find comfort in the clear word that we have preserved for us in Holy Scripture. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you again later for a trip to Olympia, which will conclude our time in Greece.